We go. Okay, chapter 8. In this week's Hayom Yom, you may have noticed it was a reference to chapter 7. In the Hayom Yom for the 27th of Nisan, the Rebbe writes that the permissible, when done for one's pleasure, is completely evil, as the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, chapter 7. So in chapter 7, the Alter Rebbe discussed what we might refer to as subjective sin. That is, the behavior is not evil, but it's the attitude or the approach or the perspective that adds a klipa form to it. The act is kosher, the intent is not. So that is a klipas noiga. This is an important vocabulary phrase to bear in mind. The word klipa means a shell. A shell both conceals the fruit that's inside it, but it also protects it. Most of life is klipa. That is, when you see it, you see the physical identity, and you have to use your imagination to recognize that there's a spiritual reality to that as well. Most things are klipas noga. The word noga means light. The light can seep through. So you ask me what's in the room, the desk, the chair, the pencil, the computer. What about God? Oh, yeah, that too. So it's not immediately evident to me. Yet, even as a desk and a computer and a pen, I don't have it doesn't have to stop being those things. I can exhume its noga, its light, its godliness by utilizing it in the service of Hashem. Now, on the periphery, there are some things that are immediately obviously godly. So, for example, on Sukkot, if you're shaking the lulav of an esrog, the only reason you're doing that is because it's a mitzvah. You would otherwise never do that. So it's immediately, obviously, only a godly activity. On the far other extreme is something that you can't even imagine that there's godliness there, that its godliness is so deeply buried that you can't imagine it. That is called shalosh klipos tameyos legamre. Three, like a three-plied, thick klipa. The shell is so thick that you can conceptually imagine that there's godliness there because there has to be godliness in everything. No thing could exist if it wasn't being fueled by God's constant attention, but it's pretty hard to imagine it. And the only way to discover that godliness is to break the klipa. So if we say, God forbid, murder is shalish klipas tameas legamri, you can't even imagine that there's godliness there. Well, if it's self-defense, okay, so I kind of cheated there. I reorganized the fact situation to make it something that it isn't really. Now, an example of this is one that you're probably familiar with. We just had it in the Parsha, so it's a good segue. There is a statement, and it seems to be verified, although everybody just says, I don't know, everybody knows it, but it does seem to have Torah basis that when Mashiach comes, pigs will be kosher. So we say, oh, we want Mashiach now. No. So we say, why is that? Because when Mashiach comes, we get to do all the things we're not allowed to do now? No, it's not like, oh, now that Mashiach is here, now we can do it. Because is there godliness in a pig? Of course. Why is it that you cannot access the godliness from the pig through pork chops in the way that you can access the godliness in the cow through meat? That's the chok. I don't know why. That's how it is. But when Mashiach will come, that is, when the world will be elevated in its godliness, so then everything will rising tide lifts all boats. So the godliness that is currently trapped in the pig will start to become accessible in a more direct fashion. Now it's only accessible by not eating it. When I resist the temptation for inappropriate behavior, I kind of, in a backwards way, elevate its godliness. But when the level of godliness is elevated in the world, its godliness becomes accessible to us. But Hashem is telling us right now, it's not available to you. This is similar to an idea you've probably heard that had Adam and Chava waited until Shabbos, the tree of knowledge's godliness would have been accessible. But they jumped the gun for all the different reasons and so on. It's beyond the scope. Now, this is going to tie into a general idea that can be a little tough to swallow because the verbiage is a little bit inflammatory. We have a rule of thumb that when we say that something is good, we don't mean that it's pleasant, like a cool breeze on a hot day. We mean not only that it is beneficial and ethical, we mean it is evidently godly. That when you see it, you see the godliness. And when something is evil, we don't mean it's evil like Haman HaRasha. We mean that its godliness is not evident. So most of life is in that middle territory, that klipas noga, where you don't immediately see the godliness, but with a creative act of godly behavior, I take the pen, I write nice things, I have exhumed its godliness. I take the pen, I write nasty things, I've buried its godliness. So that's where most of life is. There are certain extremes. Like I said, lulav and esrog is obviously godly. Why else would I do this? Other things are obviously ungodly. But why are they ungodly? And here the Alter Rebbe is telling us because Hashem is simply describing to us that its godliness is not accessible. Now, the further question as to why the godliness in these behaviors is inaccessible and the godliness in other behaviors is accessible, why is milk good and meat good, but milk and meat is suddenly not good? That's the chok quality. That's the quality that is beyond our human capacity to identify. And it is also why we don't get to make up our own mitzvahs, because it is telling us the spiritual reality that is going on. Hashem is telling us, so I may not like it, but I can't say, well, I disagree, because it's not mine. I don't like gravity because my pencil falls, but I don't get to say it's not true. It's annoying, and I can try to come up with ways. We fly airplanes and we work against gravity, but I can't deny gravity. I can say I don't like it, and I can try to work around it, but I can't say it's not a law. Okay. Based on this, we're going to introduce a definition of two terms that are very familiar. You'll all recognize the terms, but the Alter Rebbe is going to really drill down on their precise meaning, not just their vernacular meaning. And those are the words asur and mutter. Now, these are standard words that you've all heard. Asur means prohibited. Mutter means permitted. Are you allowed to do that? No, it's asur. You're allowed to do that? Yes, it's mutter. Now, herein, the Alter Rebbe is going to describe to us a real precise reading of these words. Again, something you're familiar with, and how it gives us insight into our interaction. In the Shemona Esrei, you may recognize, we say, Baruch atah Hashem matir asurim. Again, hopefully you recognize this. It's right in the beginning of the Amidah. We say it every single day, weekday, Shabbos, Yom Kippur. It means, blessed are you, Hashem, who releases the bound. Now, just parenthetically here, there was a time when people deliberately sort of misconstrued this, and they said, you see, God permits the prohibited. Matir isurim. You see, it used to be prohibited, now it's permitted. So therefore, we can lie, cheat, and steal and have bacon and eggs. So, but this is the key point. The word mutter means its godliness is released. It's free. The word asur means that its godliness is chained. Its godliness is there. Is there godliness in Haman and in pork chops? Absolutely, has to be. But its godliness is chained up. You can't access it. And other things that are mutter means that their godliness is accessible. Now, here's the tricky part. When something is mutter, or another form of that is the word kosher, kosher doesn't mean it's holy. Kosher just means it's eligible to be elevated. So when something is kosher, as we learned in chapter 7, and I interface with it, it is an opportunity to exhume its godliness. But if I interface with it with aggression, if I interface with it with slovenly gluttony, I have further plunged its godliness. So here's a little secret. Just because it's kosher, 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 and I washed my hands, and I said Al Natilas Yadayim, and I even helped somebody else find their seat. But now I sit down. Now this is probably more men than women, and you get aggressive on the buffet line to get the good piece of kugel. That is only plunging its godliness further down into the klipa. It's only an opportunity. However, since it is mutter, its godliness is available if I act with aggression or slovenly or simply mindlessly, and I'm eating in a way that's no different than an animal, also eats because I'm hungry and has nothing greater than just, well, I'm hungry, then I have further plunged its godliness deeper. However, it is recoverable because the godliness is still accessible. So if I will do tshuva, in other words, I'll say, okay, now that I am full, now I have energy to do Torah and mitzvahs and godly things. So now I have rescued that godliness. But if it is asur, if its godliness is trapped, then even if I eat it with the greatest of intentions, and I say I'm going to eat this food so that I will have nourishment, so that I will do Torah and mitzvahs. And here's the scary part, even if it's an accident, and I asked 47 rabbis, and they all told me it's kosher, kosher, kosher. But I asked the doctor, and he told me he made a mistake, or he was wrong, or it was something happened. Those are the facts. Again, I don't like gravity, but I can't deny gravity. And just because, some people say, will you give me permission? I give you permission to defy gravity. I don't care. But it's the law. It simply is. You can't pretend that it's not just because. Why? Because this is the reality that Hashem is telling us, that the godliness in these items is asur. It's trapped. So based on this, we're ready to jump in. Again, remember, good means evidently godly. And the word evil, I know it's an inflammatory word. It means its godliness is not obvious. It doesn't mean violence or horrible things that we think about. It means the godliness is not obvious. Now, hopefully not, but I can only imagine that people have, God forbid, but had this experience. The person says something nice to you with such a tone that it's not nice. What happened? I didn't do anything wrong. And if the person is particularly slimy, they can be very skilled at portraying themselves with great virtue, but everybody feels like they want to take a shower after they've been around this person. What is it? Because that's the characteristic. It's the attitude. It's the perspective. It's the intent that is layered and can potentially infest this behavior. Okay. Periches begins with the letter Vav. Remember our rule of thumb that whenever a chapter begins with the letter Vav, it means it's in continuation to the previous chapter. When it begins without the Vav, it means it's a little bit of a new idea. The link is what we quoted from that Hayom Yom, that in chapter 7, we talk about permitted behaviors that are done with a completely self-indulgent attitude. That is, there's nothing godly about that behavior, even though it's permitted, which is a little odd. There's a term the Talmud uses to be disgusting within the rules of Torah. I didn't do anything wrong. You can't get me on anything, but it's still disgusting. It doesn't have a godly flavor to it. So here we're going to now double down. In the previous chapter, we talked about permitted behaviors or released or godly eligible or godly accessible behaviors that were done with a detrimental or I'll call it a nasty, self-indulgent attitude. And here we're going to talk about straight up prohibitions. Here also by prohibited foods. Now again, that word asur we're going to ultimately define to mean trapped. Its godliness is trapped. Now, this is not only true of food, it's of course true of anything. One of the distinctive reasons why the Alter Rebbe chooses food, I mean, why not other behaviors, is because, of course, we all have to eat. And eating is something we share in common with animals. We eat and an animal eats. And one of our test cases is, what is the difference between the way I'm eating and the way the animal is eating? So, of course, we say, well, we eat kosher. That's true. But an animal, of course, would eat kosher food. If you put kosher food in front of the animal, he'd also eat it. Well, we wash our hands. That's true. Takes a few seconds. We say a bracha. Also true. Takes a few seconds. But while I'm eating, if you came in the middle of the meal, so I davened with the minyan, I washed my hands, I waited my turn, I said please and thank you, I said the bracha, I sat down. But now, in that moment, with the bib hanging on and the barbecue sauce all over my face, what is the difference between me and the animal in that moment? So here we're talking about not just the attitude, but the very fabric of the item. It's a food that is asur. Asur meaning its godliness is trapped. Isser. That's why it's called Isser. And again, standard, you ask anybody, what does the word Isser mean? It means prohibited. That's the standard term. We've all used this term. We always use this term. That's what it means. But here the Alter Rebbe is really drilling down to give us a whole other insight that it's not just that God said, well, this is prohibited. Why? I don't know. He's God. It's God is telling us that its godliness is trapped. It cannot be exhumed in this through eating it. Even somebody who ate something that is usher. Now look what it says here, because it's a little harsh. He didn't know. He made a mistake. Or he asked 17 rabbis, and the rabbi told him it's kosher, kosher, kosher. He told them. And he meant it, and nobody was being mean, and so on. But again, you could follow the doctor's advice. Doesn't mean he's a bad guy. It doesn't mean he's lazy, and so on. Either he made a mistake, he was misinformed, something happened outside of his control. It's an accident. But if there's an accident, the glass still broke. And he ate it l'shem shamayim. He ate it with the intent of serving Hashem. He said, I need to have nourishment. Why do I need to have nourishment? In order to have energy to serve Hashem. And he did everything right. But the fact is, what he ate was asur. So in the previous chapter, we talked about he acted with self-indulgence and crassness with something that was mutter. Its godliness was eligible. So in the moment, he plunged it deeper into the klipa. However, it's still an opportunity to exhume it and bring it back into its godly alignment. But now we're talking about that he did everything with the proper attitude, except, he invested in the wrong thing. He ingested this entity which its godliness is trapped. He ate it because he said, I need to have energy in order to serve Hashem. V'gam Paul Vasakain. And he taka did it. He got energy because, God forbid, if a person eats something that is asur, that's godliness is trapped, his body will still be nourished. And again, we're not talking about someone who was dying, and we're not talking about a medical emergency. Again, in those circumstances, it's not asur, it's permitted. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a guy who was hungry for lunch. He looked on the can, it had 47 hechshers, and he ate it, and he made a bracha, and he said, I'm eating only so I should have energy to serve Hashem. And then he taka went, v'kara, and he read Torah, v'hispalo, and he daven, v'keich achilahi, with the power of that food, because it will nourish him. Ein achaya shaba oilu u'mislabeshes b'tevis ha'torah v'atfila k'maya heta. The energy of that food will not be invested in the words of davening or Torah study or the mitzvah action like they would if their godliness was eligible. Because it is trapped in the klipa, and again, the klipa is the shell that conceals the godliness, and our objective is to extract the godliness from within that shell. But this godliness is so deeply embedded that it cannot be exhumed or extracted from the Sitra Achra. Now, remember the word Sitra Achra, it's actually Aramaic. It simply translates as the other side. And the other side means, again, in our context, I know it can be inflammatory, anything that is not immediately identifiable as godly. So, again, if I am shaking the lulav and esrog, I'm eating matzah, I'm fasting on Yom Kippur, I'm listening to the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, why are you doing it? It's a mitzvah. Why else would I do it? Only because it's a mitzvah. When I'm having lunch, why are you doing that? I'm hungry. What about the mitzvah? Oh, yeah, that too. So its immediacy is its physical, and our mission is to make its immediacy the godly. Remember, one of our basic rules of Chassidus is we want to achieve a degree of awareness, not only for ourselves, but for the whole world, that God is the assumption and creation is the innovation. So a beautiful thing, you ask a kid, what is a quarter? He says, that's tzedakah. You know, some people buy food with that. Really? What is a camper? You know, that's a mitzvah take. You know, some people take them, they go camping. Really? That should be the surprise. Not that you took a camper and you made it into a mitzvah tank. The surprising thing is that the mitzvah tank is being used for people to go camping. That's the awareness level that we want. So again, when it comes to eating matzah and the lulav, etc., and if all of life was only chukim, it would be a little easier. Why else are you checking your clothing for shotness? Why are you eating? Okay, it's obvious, but that is not most of life. Right? Most of life is ordinary stuff, and ordinary stuff is klipas noiga, and our job is to again extract the noiga through the klipa. When something is shalosh klipas tmeis legamre, again 3-plied, so Hashem is telling you it's not accessible. You can't get it. You're not going to be able to pull this out. So the Alter Rebbe continues, even if it is a rabbinic prohibition. Now here the Alter Rebbe doubles down on this. Shechamurim divrei seifrim yosim divrei Torah. The words of, and here's a real close reading, the words of the writers, seifrim, I want to talk about that, are harsher or stronger or more intense or something like that than the words of Torah. Now, here is a phrase, or here's a concept that we have to deal with that is alluded to in this phrase in and of itself. We have a rule that the Rabbanon, the rabbis, can make prohibitions. Many of the things that we're familiar with, obligations, prohibitions. Classic example, in Torah, it only prohibits us to eat the flesh of lactating animals together with milk. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. But fowl, chickens, which don't lactate, you can eat with the milk. And as far as we know, historically, at some point, that's what people did. But the rabbis came along and said, you can't do that anymore. So we asked the question, what does that mean? So you might say, well, what they're telling you is, look, if you eat chicken and milk, it might lead to some confusion because people sometimes or often refer to chicken as meat, the meat of the chicken. And therefore, they don't want you to stumble up against eating beef and milk. And therefore, they put a guardrail. And that's it. It's just a precaution. However, one might think, and here's really the innovative point of the Alter Rebbe, that if in fact a person ate chicken and milk, they still can elevate its godliness because in Torah law, there is no prohibition. It's just a precaution. Now, I'll give you a real, so to speak, not only a conceptual, but a real example. A person is prohibited to make a bracha on non-kosher food. Right? It's considered disrespectful. Here Hashem says, don't eat it. and I want to thank God for this non-kosher food. It's considered disgraceful. Just as an example, as a friend of mine, everybody's at their own level, and he's not at the currently learning chitas every day. So he said, "What do? I want to make a blessing. I want to thank God." So I said, "Okay." So we came up like, "Okay, you can make a shahakol on the water. That's kosher, and you'll be grateful for what it is." But here's the challenge. What if a person ate non-kosher food by accident? So of course he made the bracha beforehand because he didn't know. But now he found out. Should he make an after bracha? Should he make the after bracha? Okay, obviously beforehand, if it's not kosher, he's not going to make a bracha. He's not supposed to make a bracha. But what if he did it already and then he found out, oops, should he make the after bracha? So our answer is no, he should not make the after bracha because, again, it is not respectful that a person is making a bracha when they're doing something Hashem doesn't want. But what about chicken and milk? So the person did it already. They made a mistake. They didn't know. It was total accident. Everything is innocent. So if we say, you ready? If we say that this is really only a precaution, it's not that there's anything wrong with chicken and milk. It's just that chicken and milk could lead to a mistake. So then, if he did it already, again, he understands he shouldn't have done it, he didn't mean to do it, etc. We would say he could make the after bracha, right? Because in fact, the godliness in chicken and milk is accessible. That's one philosophy. But here the Alter Rebbe lays down a whole nother level. That when the Rabbanan say that chicken and milk, or whatever it is, any rabbinic prohibition, is asur, they're telling you that its godliness is trapped. It's not just that they get together and they say, look, either what do we found out that people like doing and we can say they can't do it so that they don't have too much fun because, next thing you know, they're going to want to rise up in rebellion. Or more seriously, we see that there's a sloppy thing going on here and there's a concern. I mean, look at all the different things we came up with. Pas Yisrael, because we didn't want fraternizing with the nations. And wine because we were afraid that it was used for idolatry. All these things that we came up with. So here the Alter Rebbe is telling you it's not just that they are setting up boundaries lest you make a mistake. They are saying that its godliness is trapped. It's asur. It can't be extracted. So of course we right away raise our hands saying, "What do you mean? Yesterday I could extract its godliness. How do you have the power to change its godliness?" Again, if we're saying this is the godly reality, how do you have that power? Now, I'm going to drop in another parenthesis here. Well, what about revoking a rabbinic prohibition? They've done that too. I'll give you an example. There was just like you're familiar with Pas Yisrael, that we only eat bread that was baked, or at least the baking was participated by Jews, and Chalav Yisrael, and that Jews supervise from the very milking of the cow, and Bishul Yisrael, that a Jew supervised from the cooking. Once upon a time, there was something called Shemen Yisrael, oil, that the oil also had to be supervised by a Jew, distinctively from anything else. However, the Rabbanan saw that the people couldn't live up to this, and therefore they revoked it. So what's going on here? So again, if we simply say, well, they're doing an assessment, again, to use a silly analogy, COVID is raging, everyone has to wear masks. It's not raging so much, you don't have to wear masks. Well, which one is it, masks or no masks? It's just, the circumstances have changed. In the winter, you wear a coat. In the summer, you don't wear a coat. The circumstance changed. Or we say that the Rabbanan have somehow identified that the godliness has morphed, either because the world has gotten so much more klipa-dik, the world has gotten so much harsher. I mean, look, between you and me, you think they had a mechitza at every wedding in Lubavitch? The world was more intuitively refined. People didn't misbehave so much. So it's not just that they thought they saw that there was, like, to use again this analogy, it was like a virus that morphed, and therefore the godliness became further and further plunged. Because remember, the godliness in kosher food is accessible. It's not overt. It's not obvious. It's accessible. And then because the world became that much more schmutzig, that much more klipa, they identified that its godliness got plunged further and further down. So again, it's not simply that they're putting up a new roadblock because people get careless. So back to my example, the person mistakenly ate chicken and milk, and now he says, "Oops, okay, I didn't know, and fine, and you're a nice guy and everything." But do we say that he makes the after bracha? And based on this understanding, we'd probably say no, because what the Rabbanan have told us is the godliness is trapped, not just because it's a chutzpah. How could a guy make a bracha and he's thanking Hashem when he's violating God's will? But we're talking about the after bracha. He made a mistake. Okay, it's done already. This is the point that the Alter Rebbe is saying here. Not only that the Rabbanan, so to speak, can do that, but that it's harsher, that when the Rabbanan identify something as prohibited, they're saying that its godliness has become that much more deeply trapped. And therefore, our sages have identified that it is no longer accessible. And this is a little bit about that idea. There's a story told of a chassid of the Alter Rebbe who came to the Alter Rebbe with a tremendous problem. His son was having doubts about godliness. It's nothing new under the sun. And the Alter Rebbe said that his son had accidentally drunk milk that wasn't Chalav Yisrael. Now, Chalav Yisrael is a rabbinic decree. Remember, all cow milk is kosher. What is Chalav Yisrael? That we don't know that it's cow milk, because we were afraid that they were mixing other animal milk into the pot. So therefore, we required rabbinic supervision from day one, from the milking. But if in fact you drank cow milk that wasn't supervised, you'd think, well, the fact is it is cow milk. No, the fact that we insisted on it means we insisted on it. So again, this is that idea that the Rabbanan have identified this, I'm going to call it mutation, of the klipa that has become so much stronger that we can no longer access the godliness in this manner. And this is alluded to, if you look in the precise wording, it calls it divrei soifrim. A sofer, of course, is a scribe. He writes. He's not just interpreting, but he's actually writing it. Now, of course, this sounds like, oh, well, I got to write my own book too. Well, I guess if you consider yourself to be that spiritually sensitized that you can identify it, maybe, just like a doctor. Any doctor can tell you what they taught him in medical school. But there's a certain sensitivity. There's a certain intuitive characteristic that maybe can be taught, maybe can't be taught. It's the product of experience and knowledge and some other level that they're able to tap into. Because again, remember what the Alter Rebbe is giving us this sort of backstage insight to is that when something is asur, prohibited, meaning trapped, it is Hashem identifying for us that's the state of its godliness. It is imprisoned in this klipa. And that's why, in that sense, it's chamor, it's harsher, it's sort of worse, because it's been that much more klipad as a result thereof. Therefore, gam hayetzer hara, v'koyach hamasava ledvarim hasudim, hu shedin mishein nechroin, shu hayetzer hara shal umais oivdi galulim, shenafshesei misholosh klipas hatmeis. Mashenken hayetzer hara. I'll come back and translate. Don't worry, I just want to get the idea. V'koyach hamasava ledvarim hamutorim lamalas toivasoi, hu shed mishein yudoyin, v'fi sheyochol lachzol l'kedusha kedliel. So here the Alter Rebbe lays out for us that there are, again, and this is one of the gifts of Chassidus, we're starting to put terms and categories on something that is essentially uncategorizable. It's like music or color. If I say red, there's many shades of red. So we come up with creative words. It's bright red, it's brick red, it's sunset red. Again, we're all trying to communicate a subtlety. So the Alter Rebbe here introduces that there are, again, two overwhelmingly generalized, but still, types of Yetzer Haras. One is a foreign Yetzer Hara, and the other is what we're calling a Jewish Yetzer Hara. So the Jewish Yetzer Hara is a little easier to understand. It's the desire for permitted items. So if I want to have whatever the permitted item is, material things, food, jewelry, fame, fortune, and so on, but it's mutter, its godliness is accessible. Why then is it called a Yetzer Hara? Because I don't want it for the godliness. I want it for how it validates my identity. Because we are the combination of the physical and the spiritual. Everything we do either affirms our physical self or it affirms our spiritual self, which essentially means it affirms Hashem. So if I want any material item, whether it's bread and water or it's steak, for how it validates myself, so then it's not about godliness. It's a form of ra. Ra means evil. Again, it's a very sensitive word, and if you don't like that word, you're going to miss the whole message of Tanya because we get caught up on that word. And I don't like that word. I don't like it either because it's a little close to home. But this is the point the Alter Rebbe is trying to illustrate for us. Are you saying that's wrong? Again, to know about what you can do and can't do, we don't need Tanya. We got libraries of books to tell you can eat this, you can't eat that, stand up, sit down. We're talking about this sensitivity. And again, hopefully not, but if anybody's ever had this kind of sensitive interaction with someone who maybe is not so nice, but they didn't punch you in the face, but they had something that was in a way harsher, they can, unfortunately, sadly, potentially relate to it. Hopefully not. So there are what is called a Jewish Yetzer Hara. Now, again, what's a Jewish Yetzer Hara? Any Yetzer Hara I have. That's a reasonable thing. Other people are unreasonable. But it means that the impulse is for something within my spiritual frame of reference. Because the challenge is to make the ordinary sanctified. But then there is a Yetzer Hara for items that are completely outside of my realm. Now, I've never interviewed a polar bear, but there is a philosophy, take it for what it's worth, that a polar bear is not innately violent against humans until it experiences it. Then it becomes desirous thereof. Or to use a little less dramatic illustration, thank God this has mostly been eliminated from society, but it's like cigarette smoking. Nobody enjoys their first cigarette. They're coughing and huffing. So what happens? They keep doing it until it becomes a habit. That is, they defeat their nature's rejection thereof. The body is saying, I don't want this, but they force it on themselves. And again, in our broader secular society, this often happens. People who don't have any interest in this behavior, they have a physical recoiling from it, but their society tells them that they're being silly or they're being timid or they're being shy or they're being some bad thing, and therefore they should force themselves to do it, and they'll force themselves until it becomes something that they like, God forbid, misbehaviors and so on. These are not intuitive. Again, the body naturally rejects them. It coughs on the first cigarette. It has that bad experience. And then they force it on, and now he wants it. So these are called, Alter Rebbe is describing, as foreign Yetzer Haras. They're not intuitive to the Jews' neshama. They are intuitive to the nation's neshama. That is, again, we're using a broad term, and maybe it's contextual. The Jew has no desire for pork chops, meaning his neshama has no desire for it. The nations do. It's not a bad thing for them. So he goes and he's got this trepidatious moment, and he does it, and then he does it again. And as the Talmud says, a person sins, they repeat the sin, and then after a while, they forgot it's even a sin. Just to share a quick story, there's a guy I used to know, and he had like a store, and he had an employee who was quote unquote an honest guy, and the guy every day used to go for lunch. One day he forgot his wallet, so he said, "Okay, I'll just take $10 out of the till, and I'll pay it back tomorrow." And I guess if you would have hooked him up to the truthometer at that moment, he would have said, "Yeah, he's going to pay it back." But he forgot, and then he did, and after a while, he started thinking, "I'm entitled to take $10 from the till every day." So again, the first time there's all this awkwardness and justification and hesitation, Ava Vashana, he violates and he repeats it, it became permitted. Now this became part of his routine. So this is what can happen. And the Alter Rebbe again, and we might say, "Oh, Rebbe, you got to know some of the people I know. They don't even think about it. This is there's, but everybody again at their level has something that is so bizarre. And again, you go back, and I'm not here to do a psychological study unless the person is literally, mentally disturbed. And the first time there was some shakiness, the second time a little shakiness, the third time it became already a routine thing to do. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is warning us about, that violation can bring us to something that is completely outside of any human perspective. And again, we can look around our society. Who would have believed that we'd have to be having discussions about these things? And now they're considered to be reasonable. And if you think it's a little odd, you're the weirdo. Okay. Someone has a question. Yes.
Was just a comment. Thank you, Rabbi. And there was a comment in the Goodnick Chumash yesterday about the Parsha that spoke about, all the things we couldn't eat, all the non-kosher animals, and that spoke about eating treif, and that if you start one time, then it might lead to another and another, and then it starts blocking your own ability to reach your own godliness. And so I just thought if anyone else has the Goodnick Chumash, it's a good comment, commentary or whatever to read. It was very good.
Absolutely. I mean, this is later on in chapter 18, the Alter Rebbe will explain that nobody sins thinking that they're really sinning, meaning we justify it's not so bad, everybody does it, I'm not so holy anyway. But this is the allure. It begins with doing the permitted for pleasure without any godliness, and then not the opposite of escalates, whatever, deteriorates from there. Yeah, Batya, you got to unmute.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. I have a question. In the example that you gave of the person who consumed something that was usher, but he still used that energy to do Torah mitzvahs. Okay, on one hand, he wasn't able to elevate it, but then what about the Torah mitzvahs that he did? Is it a wash? Does Hashem not even recognize it?
Well, again, the guy stole, but he gave it all to tzedakah. So, is there some benefit? I mean, again, I'm not the judge to determine it, but there's a certain weight around that godliness that just cannot be elevated, no matter how many mitzvahs he does with it. And certainly the victim is not going to be appeased that you stole my money and you gave it to the poor guy. So there's always going to be this residual impact. And again, what if it's done by accident? Less so, but it's still there. I mean, again, I don't like gravity, but I can't pretend it's not there. I can work to move around it. I have airplanes, but I can't pretend that gravity doesn't exist just because I don't like it. Okay, so here again, the Alter Rebbe is the sequence again begins with permitted acts that are done without any awareness other than, well, I want it. And if something is done simply out of I want it, it's, again, in our general society, unfortunately, it could potentially creep into our society. Hopefully not. I do what I want, when I want, where I want. Wow, that guy is the coolest. He's reached the pinnacle. Well, that's what an animal is. An animal does what it wants, when it wants, where it wants. It doesn't say, excuse me, is this somebody else's tomatoes? It eats the tomatoes. It tramples where it wants. It does what it wants. So this is not something that we hold up to be some great aspiration. Unfortunately, in our society, we often do that. We say, I don't care what people do in the privacy of their own homes. I mean, really? You don't care if the guy's up there, God forbid, hurting himself? Well, I mean, so again, these become the gateways, and it's nothing new under the sun. But who would have believed that we're talking about things that we're talking about as if it needs to be discussed? Why not? Sure. Again, on and on and on. So this is the point that the Alter Rebbe is making. So when a person engages in permitted again meaning eligible, but simply for self-indulgence, in a way they have plummeted it that much deeper. They've now used the Torah as something for personal benefit. They had an opportunity to elevate the godliness, and instead they just plunged it deeper into klipa. because it was just driven by animalistic impulse. That's one form. Another form is, or the next stage is, they go to klipa. Mamish shalosh klipas tmeis lagamri, because the driving force is some form of, this is what I want. And if I'm driven simply by, well, this is what I want, so why limit it only to permitted things? Okay. However, I'm sorry. Hushain Mishain Yudoin the fish Kedusha. So as we said, there are certain impulses that are intuitive and are godly, or not godly. They are Jewish. Again, that's what we're describing, and that is they're the impulse for that which is permitted. And since it is permitted, it's always eligible to be rescued post facto. You can rescue it. So even though at the moment I only ate this food because I was hungry and I didn't think about anything godly other than the fact that I'm hungry, but since it is in fact godly eligible, or its godliness is eligible to be elevated, if I say, okay, well, that was really indulgent, I really need to utilize this energy to serve Hashem, there is that opportunity. But if it's usur, trapped, then again, ultimately, I'm never really going to be completely able to extract it. Now, nothing stands in the way of tshuva, and we can turn a negative into a positive. Even the Talmud, that is legally, we recognize that deliberate sins can be transformed into merits, but that takes a really intense level of tshuva. Ach mikol makom, nevertheless, koidem shechazul l'kedusha, before I now turn around. So again, in that moment, when the person is just simply indulging in their being only aware of themselves, and again, this can happen with people, as we talked about before. When I see people only as how they serve me, we talked about this too. This is my bus driver, this is my dentist, meaning their existence is validated by how they serve me. This is a sensitivity that we need to be cautious to. I'm not seeing them for their godliness. I'm only seeing them as how they serve me. Who sitrach v'klipa. Again, even if it's kosher, but in the moment I'm only engaging with it in indulgence. At that moment, it is trapped in the sitra achra. I've plunged it that much deeper. And even afterwards, harashimu mimenu nishar davik beguf. There's still always going to be a certain resonance of that. There's going to be a residual impact. Like when I erase a word, like in a Torah scroll, if they erase it, there's always going to be a little bit of remnant. Or if a person, God forbid, has an injury, even when it heals, there's a little scarring. There's a little bit of that impact that's there. It's not just a memory of it, but there's an actual tangible representation of that characteristic. And that's why whenever we act out of indulgence, it's not only in the moment, but there's a certain character trait that we should be more and more aware of that needs to be addressed. Ki mikol meichelu mashka nasa teikif damo bas mipsarai. And this is a concept, I mean, it's almost kind of ironic. We talk a lot about how Torah study is the primary mechanism for us to be transformed in our relationship with Hashem. Why? So we often use the analogy of food. Meaning, if I learn an idea, or if I engage in a behavior, it's still a little bit separate from me. But when I eat food, a little becomes my flesh. So Torah study, but don't forget that eating also literally becomes your flesh. So everything you eat, I mean, we all know this story, right? So if we eat something that disagrees with us, why, we get heartburn tomorrow. Why should I get heartburn tomorrow? I only ate it then because it became part of our very being. Well, ultimately, we would say that is true of every experience. And that's why we have to be judicious about what we allow into our existence. Not only what we allow to come in our mouth, food, but what we allow to be seen, to be listened to, because everything about or every experience impacts our very identity. You know, we talk about this, that the obligation in Torah to establish judges at the gates, it means the gates of our very existence, that we have to make sure that what goes in our eyes and our ears, we are as meticulous about what goes in our mouth. But here we're talking about food, again, because we eat all the time. It's like an animal eats, and we have to distinguish ourselves. But here's the most profound illustration, because when you eat the food, it literally becomes absorbed. And there is this theory, the Ramban brings it, that the kosher laws also touch upon this, at least a life lesson. The example being the birds, that there are no carnivorous birds that are kosher, vultures and eagles and falcons and so on. And even the mammals that are kosher are all vegetable eaters, because there's a certain aggression characteristic that's associated with them, and it immediately becomes part of our being. There's a saying that the time of davening is a time of battle, because a person sits down to daven, right away my mind starts to wander, and I have to battle. Well, in a sense, we say the same thing with eating. When we eat, it's a time of battle. Am I eating simply out of biological imperative? I'm hungry, I eat, in which case I'm not different than the animal. He also eats out of biological imperative. Or am I eating because it's an opportunity to bring the godliness? And it's a toughie, right? Because food tastes good. So it's very difficult to reach that level where I'm eating purely for the service of Hashem. You know, we've talked about this. You recognize the idea. We say that Yom HaKippurim, Yom Kippur, is the day that is comparable to Purim. We say comparable. Isn't Yom Kippur loftier? Well, on Yom Kippur, we access godliness by demonstrating that we are not beholden to our biological imperative, because I don't eat. So if I say, why am I eating? Because I'm hungry. Why don't you eat on Yom Kippur? You also get hungry because it's Yom Kippur, meaning I'm not beholden. I don't have to eat just because I'm hungry. Because when I get hungry on Yom Kippur, I don't eat. So why, when I get hungry on Tuesday, do I eat? Because that's a choice. Don't say it's not a choice. As they say, pain is involuntary. Suffering is voluntary. If I stub my toe, it hurts. If I decide that the universe is out to get me, that's voluntary. That's suffering is voluntary, pain is involuntary. So Purim, we have to eat. It's one of the mitzvahs of Purim. So how is that like Yom Kippur? Because that's the greater challenge. To not eat in the service of Hashem, it's not fun, but it's a little more obvious. Why am I fasting? Because I'm in the service of Hashem. Eating in the service of Hashem is hard because I like eating. It's fun. It tastes good. It stimulates my humanity. Can I eat with the same godly intent as I don't eat on Yom Kippur? That's the challenge. And that's what we're told. On Purim, yes. On Purim, you eat and drink and so on, all only in the service of Hashem. That's a more demanding level than to say not to eat. Because not eating, I don't like doing. So why am I doing it? For the service of Hashem. Like sitting in the sukkah in the rain. Eating, I like doing. Why am I doing that? Can I reach that level of doing it for the service of Hashem? So as soon as I absorb the food, immediately the battle begins. Is this a physical act or is this a godly act? So if it's done out of impulse, then even if it's mutter, the godliness is accessible, it's still an animalistic act. But it's eligible to be rescued. It's eligible. Before I have gone and now redirected that energy to holiness, at that moment, it's totally antagonistic. It is totally antagonistic to godliness, and it's only klipa. And even afterwards, even if I say, okay, wow, that was really indulgent, I better go and really make sure that I utilize this energy to serve Hashem. But again, like an apology, like an injury, there's still going to be a little bit of that residue. There's still going to be, unless the person does such an intense level of tshuva. But there's still, I'm sorry, I know I was short with you, but I was, I got all kinds of excuses and explanations, but it's still not so nice when the person is harsh. It still stings when the person was mean. It's still unpleasant when the person was biting. Who sitra achve klipav? Gam acher kach harshim mimenu nisha davik beguf. Lios mikom Michael and mashkanat steak of dam bas mibsar. B'lechein, therefore, tzarich haguf lechibet hakever. Therefore, the body needs to have the deterioration in the grave. Why is it that when a person passes, their body disintegrates? Because the body has taken on the characteristic of the physical. And the rule of physical things is that they expire. You recall that God tells Adam and Chava, the day you eat from the tree, you'll die. They ate from the tree, they lived to be 900. What is that? Because they associated themselves with that which expires. So even though they're not dead, but the concept of death has been introduced, meaning a person, really all of creation, is a combination of the physical and the spiritual. Why should the person die? Why doesn't this person live forever based on their neshama? Because unfortunately, we have taken on the character of the physical. Why is it that when Mashiach comes and the world is brought to its total sensitivity, we'll have the coming to life of the dead? Why that? Because that's the biggest thing you could think of? Because that's the biggest defiance of the physical? Because the spiritual will then be dominant, and the physical will follow the spiritual. So you have a physical reality and you have a spiritual reality. Right now, we live in a world of the physical. Because when you ask me to describe what's in the room, I describe the physical things. When I really should say, Ein Od Milvado, there's nothing else but God. There's only God in the room. Like the Alter Rebbe is quoted as saying on his deathbed, I don't see the physical, I only see the spiritual. Well, that's not a reality that I live at this moment. That's what we aspire to. This, parenthetically, is tied in with the concept that we have. It's in the Talmud. It's not just a Hasidic concept, that the righteous do not deteriorate in the grave. Now, of course, we don't go testing this. We don't go digging up graves. But we have this concept that the righteous do not deteriorate in the grave. Why not? Because their bodies have completely taken on the character of their neshama. So since it's taken on the total character of their neshama, it has no residual impact of the physical. Why then does the person die? So like the Talmud says, there were 4 people who never sinned. They die because that's the way the world has been set up. Because of the sin of the tree of knowledge, the world has been set up that people die, unfortunately. But that's the reality. But it's not, that's the rule, so to speak. I shouldn't say it's real. That's the rule. But the tzaddik who's never indulged his physical self, so his body only has the character of his neshama. That lives on forever. Otherwise, we need to have the chibut hakever to beat out that last remaining characteristic that is so deeply buried, but it's still there because of those indulgent moments. That the body has just by being in the world. If you leave a car sitting for 3 years, you say, well, now it should be perfect. But it doesn't. It rusts because that's the way of the world. The physical elements of the world cause the physical things to deteriorate. That's sort of the way it works. That's the rules. The physical world is subject to the deterioration of the physical existence. And therefore, the body, by the mere fact that it lives in this world, is affected by the rules of nature. As they say, time is undefeated, right? It takes its toll no matter what. Unless a person is like Rabbeinu HaKadosh, we'll talk about him in a moment, who never benefited from this world. Who is Rabbeinu HaKadosh? Who is our holy rabbi? It's a reference to Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, sometimes known obviously as Rabbeinu HaKadosh, as we'll talk about here, and sometimes known simply as Rebbe. He is the author of the Mishnah. So just a little history about him because it illustrates this point. When Rebbe saw that the Jewish people were being dispersed and so on, he is the one who took the radical step to write down the Mishnah. He wrote the Mishnah. Remember, the oral Torah was literally oral, was passed on from teacher to student. Yes, people had notes and so on, but there was no centralized, absolute authoritative text. That was done by Rebbe. Now, Rebbe, because in his position as a Jewish leader, didn't just get to sit and study Torah all day. He also had to be involved in helping the community. And this brought him in constant contact with the Roman authorities who ruled the land at the time, and particularly Mark Antony, which Mark Antony exactly it was, I don't know. I don't know my Roman history and if that was like a common name, whatever it was. He hobnobbed with a lot of the big shots. And he lived, as the Talmud describes, in absolute luxury with opulent wealth. So you think, well, come on, this guy, okay, there's beauty, and he said at the end of his life that he never benefited from this physical world, even to the smallest finger. What does it mean? It's got meals and servants. And he said it was only so that I could communicate with and impress the Romans to procure benefit for the Jewish people. So we're left with a choice. Either he's lying, because he said it. It's not that we said it about him. He said it. Or it's absolutely the truth. There's no in between here. There's not like, well, he's being humble or he's brag. Either he's a braggart and a liar, or it's absolutely the truth. So again, life would be simpler if we could just come up with some arbitrary measurement. That if your car costs under $20,000, you're humble. If it costs over $20,000, you're indulgent. If you have two tuna sandwiches, you're indulgent. And if you have one sandwich, you're fine. There's a sarcastic comment, that you buy the used car and for an extra $200, they'll put a dent in the trunk so that you look very humble and everyone should see how humble you are. So the answer is, it's not about some sort of objective scale that we come up with a number, and as long as you're under that number, you're considered humble. And if you're over that number, a person can be self-aware with bread and water, and a person can be totally in the service of Hashem with opulent wealth. So you don't get to say, well, I only had one, so therefore I'm humble. It's even with minimal, it could be in the service of Hashem or not in the service of Hashem. And that's the awareness level that we are describing here. All right, we'll stop here, to be continued next.